Good evening, dreamers, wherever in the world you are tonight, under city lights or beneath the quiet stretch of countryside sky. I invite you to drift back in time with me. Close your eyes, if you like. Breathe softly, and imagine a world that once stood still in astonishment when the sun itself seemed to disappear. The year was 536, a year that chroniclers across empires would later call the worst year to be alive, for in that year, this got dim and stayed dim for many months. It was as if the warmth of the heavens had been snuffed out, leaving the earth in a long, cold twilight. In Constantinople, people looked up from their markets and murmured to one another that God was displeased. In Ireland, monks would later write of a year without bread, when crops failed and frost came too soon. And in China, they noted a strange yellow haze that veiled the sun. Summer snow, dim light, unending cold. Even in the great cities, there was confusion. But in the villages, where people lived close to the soil, it was pure dread. Imagine the peasants waking at dawn, only to find that dawn never came. The sky remained gray, the air still and strange. Birds did not sing. The sunlight, when it reached the ground, was pale and weak, as though it had passed through smoke. And for months, the warmth never returned. No one understood what was happening. The science of volcanoes and climate had not yet been written. The people only knew that the world felt broken. The earth was cooling, harvests were dying, and strange mists drifted across the fields. There were whispers that demons were walking under the sky, or that the end of the world was near. In the great Byzantine court, Emperor Justinian still ruled his empire vast, his ambition endless, yet even he could not command the sun to shine. His cities dimmed under the grey light. Famine began to creep through the empire's outer lands. Far to the north, in the frozen reaches of Scandinavia, the cold worsened until even hardy hunters starved. Across the seas, in the Americas, trees recorded in their rings a year of absence, as if time itself had taken a deep breath and refused to move. But perhaps the strangest thing was how quiet everything became. The songs of insects fell silent. The usual buzz of life, animals, birds, wind, all seemed to pause. It was a silence heavy enough to make people whisper instead of speak. And yet, life went on, as it always does, even under a sunless sky. Fires were lit in every home. People clung to routine, because routine was survival. They milked their animals, tilled what little soil they could, gathered herbs that still grew in the shadowed forest. And they prayed. Oh, how they prayed. They prayed for the return of light, for the forgiveness of whatever sin had drawn this curse upon them. And as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the strange twilight became their new normal. Children were born under gray skies. Old men died without seeing another sunrise. And somewhere, perhaps, a small child stood outside her cottage, watching the dim horizon, wondering if the world had always been this way. Because when something lasts long enough, even disaster becomes ordinary. Dreamer, before we move deeper into this twilight world, before we uncover what truly caused the sun to fade and how it changed the lives of millions, take a slow breath. The story of the summer that never came is not just about darkness, it's about how humanity endured it, and how, even in the coldest years, we found ways to keep the warmth alive. When the light went thin in 536, everyone, emperor, merchant, monk, and farmer looked upward and felt the same smallness. Empires did not feel their grandeur, they felt the weather. Kings discovered that gold could not warm a sky. In Constantinople, markets grew quiet. Merchants who once shouted prices now whispered. The great basilica's domes, like vast lanterns, gave off a weak glow. Ministers scratched numbers on wax tablets, worrying not about wars, but about wheat. The imperial granaries thinned. Long supply lines from the provinces frayed when harvests failed or roads sank in mud. The men who recorded what they saw, clerks, monks, and scribes, became the first historians of this dim year. Their words are spare, written by men who had never thought to describe daylight. The sun shone for about half an hour. One wrote. Then it was like the moon. In monasteries, where ink was precious, monks bent over parchment by candlelight, writing of barley that failed and cattle that starved. Their lists are dry but full of quiet heartbreak. Far to the east, imperial astronomers in China also noticed the dimming. For them, the heavens reflected the harmony or disorder of the realm. When sunlight faltered and lunar records grew confused, they feared cosmic warning. Reports passed from the observatories to the throne. The emperor's advisors debated taxes, grain transport, and divine will, all in the same breath. In Europe's cloisters, abbots and hermits wrote a different kind of ledger. Names of the dead, the starving, the steadfast. They noted frost and months that should have been kind, bread baked from seed grain, cattle hides traded for food. These were not grand histories, but the heartbeat of endurance. Governors tried decrees. They opened storehouses, rationed grain, restricted exports. On paper, it looked orderly. In practice, the wagons sometimes never came. When caravans were robbed or roads flooded, an entire town went hungry. Bureaucracy could not feed the stomach. And yet, amid that hardship, there were gestures of grace. Neighbors shared events. Widows received handfuls of grain from those who had a little more. A shepherd slaughtered one small sheep to feed many. No chronicler named them, but these acts made up the true civilization of that gray summer. In villages, people sought explanations. Some said God was angry. Others blamed smoke from faraway fires. A few thought the heavens themselves had shifted, that the sun's path had changed. Practical folk just adapted. They fed their animals extra hay, dried what little fruit grew, watched the sky like a living clock that had lost its rhythm. Merchants learned to live with delay. Ships waited in fog. Caravans slowed across wet plains. Markets where silks and spices had once changed hands, now dealt mostly in barley and salt. And yet, commerce endured, human stubbornness, dressed as hope. The dimming also changed daily life. Craftsmen worked by lamplight. Children played in twilight and slept longer. Festivals shrank. Songs became quieter, closer to lullabies than to anthems. When light fails, people turn inward. They make peace with stillness. In courts and councils, men with quills argued about grain prices and troop rations. Armies starved, so taxes rose, pressing hardest on those who could least afford it. But what united kings and peasants alike was helpless wonder. No one could command the sun. Chroniclers described the colors with care: sun like a dull coin, air thick as smoke. They named what they could not change. Their calm, factual lines echo across centuries. The tone of people holding on to reason while the world dimmed around them. We now know it was likely dust, volcanic ash from far-off eruptions, suspended high in the stratosphere, cooling the earth. But the people of that age did not know that. They lived as though the end of warmth itself had come. And yet, life continued. The dim year passed into the next. Grain sprouted again, thin but green. Calves were born. The bells of monasteries still rang, marking hours no longer bright but still steady. Even in twilight, time moves forward. Before we move on, dreamer, take a soft breath. The people of that age could not see the cause of their darkness, but they still woke, worked, and waited for light. By the time the second gray summer arrived, the strangeness had become routine. People no longer asked what had happened to the sun. They simply lived inside its absence. In one quiet valley of what we would now call northern France, a farmer named Guillaume began keeping count of his stores. He was not a scholar or priest, just a man who knew that memory fades faster than hunger. On the back of a broken wax tablet, he etched tallies of barley, rye, and beans. He drew small marks for each day his family had bred. Those faint scratches were a kind of prayer, numbers standing guard against emptiness. Across the known world, there were thousands like him. Women saved seed grain in cloth bundles and hid them behind walls. Millers learned to grind rougher flour to make it last longer. Shepherds traveled farther with thinner flocks. Life became arithmetic, a slow, daily negotiation between what was left and what must be kept for tomorrow. In the evenings, the air was cool and strange. Smoke from hearth fires drifted upward into the pale light, and families huddled together, trading stories of better years. Children who had never seen a bright noon stared into the dim sky as if trying to remember something they had never known. Monks continued to record these scenes. In one monastery near the Rhine, a scribe noted, "The people have grown used to a lesser sun." The phrase is haunting, both resigned and brave. In their silence, those monks preserved not just the facts of the famine, but the sound of a world adjusting its heartbeat. In England, chroniclers described frost and bees failed to wake, and honey, once a sweet luxury, turned rare. In the lowlands, peasants began boiling nettles and bark to make bitter stews. A widow named Agnes, mentioned in a parish ledger, traded a copper cup, her last heirloom, for a few measures of barley. The monk who recorded it added a quiet note. She thanked the Lord that she could feed her children. These brief glimpses, scattered in ink and parchment, are all that remain of millions of unseen lives. Yet each one opens a small window into how ordinary people faced what felt like the dimming of creation. As the months passed, markets changed shape. The great fairs where merchants once sold fine cloth and spices turned into gatherings for grain exchange. Prices were unpredictable. One week a sack of rye cost a few copper coins. The next, twice as much. In some places barter returned. People traded shoes for grain, candles for milk, labor for a meal. It wasn't new, just older ways resurfacing, stripped of comfort. And still, amid all this uncertainty, life found rhythm. A farmer's wife needed bread, singing softly so the children wouldn't hear her worry. Priests led processions through the fields, praying for the return of sunlight. Bells rang for births and deaths alike, their tones carrying across the cold fields like a thread tying one heart to another. In some villages, communal ovens became centers of warmth and gossip. Families took turns baking their week's bread, talking quietly while waiting their turn. The smell of smoke and coarse dough offered small comfort, a reminder that they were still together, still human. Not everyone despaired. Some saw beauty in the muted world. Painters and illuminators began using darker pigments, deep blues and umbers that seemed to mirror the sky itself. The art of that age turned inward, rich with quiet faith and patience. Even music changed. Chances lawed, their notes longer and lower, echoing through stone chapel slag sighs. We often imagine history as noise, war cries, speeches, and revolution. But there are ages like this one, built from silence. The kind of silence that hums softly under everything, steady as breathing. It is the sound of endurance. Somewhere, on one of those gray evenings, Gia must have looked across his fields, thin, but alive, and felt something like peace. The worst had not ended, but life was still possible. A faint dawn shimmered through the haze. It was not light as his father had known it, but it was enough to see the soil beneath his boots. That is how people survived. Not through grand plans, but through the small discipline of keeping faith with tomorrow. So, dreamer, take a breath. The world has been dark before. Humanity has learned, again and again, how to wait for the sun. The years that followed became known in whispers as the Hungry Ones. Across Europe-Asia and the edge of the northern seas, the world cooled. Crops failed, and skies remained gray. No one knew it was global. No word like that existed yet. But all who lived beneath the heavens felt the same slow ache of cold. In the north, the wind seemed sharper. Fields that once yielded barley and oats now sprouted only stubborn weeds. Farmers watched frost creep across the soil, even in late spring, tracing its silver fingers around each sprouting stem. It was as if the seasons themselves had forgotten their order. There are records from Ireland, from Constantinople, from China, all noting that the sun shone weekly, that snow fell in midsummer, that birds migrated early and did not return. Even the sea seemed subdued. Its color turned from blue to gray. In one village, in the foothills of the Alps, smoke drifted from chimneys day and night. Families burned anything that would catch furniture, broken carts, even fence posts. When there is cold enough, wood becomes worth more than gold. From this time come stories of wandering smoke, ghostly bands of mist, moving low across the land. Travelers swore they could hear faint voices in the fog, as if the sky itself murmured. In truth, it was wind funneling through ruined barns and empty fields. But in a frightened world, sound becomes symbol. The cold drove people inward. Windows were sealed with cloth, hearths glowed constantly, their firelight trembling against stone walls. Children played closer to the flames. In monasteries, candles burned longer, and the smell of wax filled the corridors. The monks wrote less about theology, more about weather. This winter, one wrote, was like no other. We could not bury our dead. The earth was too hard. Beyond the villages, the forests changed too. Hunters found fewer animals, and some species vanished from local memory. Wolves grew bold, stalking their hamlets, their eyes glinting from the tree line. Hunger, after all, is democratic. And yet, amid all that harshness, there was beauty. An airy one. The haze gave the sky strange colors. At dawn, it shone with pale copper. At dusk, a dim violet. Some said it looked like the edge of heaven, the light that souls might see before they enter eternity. Poets, few as they were, wrote verses about a dying sun wrapped in mourning cloth. But practical folk adapted. Millers rebuilt their wheels to work in half-frozen streams. Fishermen cut holes in ice and learned new patience. Women mended clothes endlessly, turning scraps into warmth. Humanity's greatest strength, even then, was invention born of need. One parchment from a monastery near Ravenna mentions a curious thing. The monks began recording the smoke as direction each day, believing it foretold whether the next season would be mild or cruel. East meant mercy, west meant hunger. It wasn't science, but it was order, a way to make sense of the senseless. As the winters deepened, migration began. Families abandoned exhausted villages and walked toward cities, carrying bundles of grain, icons, or nothing at all. Roads filled with silent processions, gray cloaks against gray weather. Some found refuge, others faded into the margins of history. In Constantinople, the emperor ordered vast cauldrons, placed in the city squares, where poor citizens could receive soup made from whatever remained in the imperial stores. Chroniclers record that the line stretched for hours. The rich gave alms in hope of divine favor, while the poor prayed simply to live another day. In the far north, legends of this time still survive. Tales of the wandering smoke, the sleeping sun, and the wolf years. For generations, parents told their children those stories beside fires, long after the haze had lifted. It became a kind of inherited caution. Remember the year the light failed, and keep your stores full. The earth had tilted into a temporary shadow, but humanity adjusted its rhythm. When warmth returned slowly, uncertainly, those who remained carried the memory like a scar beneath the skin of time. If you stand today on a cold morning and see your breath drift upward, remember that there were years when every breath in the world rose into a sky that seemed to have forgotten light. And still, people endured. So, breathe softly now, dreamer. History's darkness always gives way to dawn. Not at once, but gently, like frost melting from the grass. By the 5th year of dim light, the world had begun to measure time not by seasons, but by losses. Every spring was a question. Eberi autumn, an answer written in hunger. In the valleys of Gaul, farmers no longer sowed with hope, but with habit. The soil was thin, exhausted, stripped of its pulse. Grain heads grew small, their color pale, almost gray, like the sky above them. Even when the rains came, they fell at the wrong times, flooding one week, vanishing the next. A field could turn from mud to dust within the old rhythms of agriculture, the prayers, the planting days, the harvest feasts, still continued, but they felt like echoes. Songs once sung with laughter were now murmured in half voices, their words reshaped by caution. If the sun allows, one line went, "We shall eat." Those who kept records wrote less about kings and more about weather. In northern Italy, a clerk scribbled, "We dig roots now." His ink fades mid-sentence, as though the page itself had starved. Famine is not a single event. It moves like a tide, quiet, then sudden, pulling whole families with it. First go the old, then the very young. Then come the choices no one wants to remember. In one coastal village, fishermen turned their nets toward the shore, hoping to catch river eels instead of sea fish. The sea, they said, had turned cold and strange. Even the fish are afraid. When that failed, they boiled seaweed and kelp. The smell of brine and smoke hung over their huts for months. Along the great Roman roads, travelers grew thinner. Pilgrims, merchants, beggars, they all looked the same. Cloaked shapes moving through mist. Villages set up small altars beside crossroads where travelers could rest, pray, or die. Those who passed by left bread crusts or coins for the next wanderer. The road itself became a story, the Famine Road, as it was called in many tongues. In monasteries, the rhythm of bells continued, steady as a heartbeat, but their echoes carried through emptier halls. The monks shared what they could, and their soup kitchens became sanctuaries. They boiled everything edible: roots, bark, sometimes even leather softened with water. The records speak gently. "We made broth for the hungry." They do not name the hungry. There were too many. Somewhere along those grey paths walked a woman named Leora, though her name appears only once, in a small ledger near Rivi. She was listed as a traveler who arrived with 2 children and no shoes. The scribe added, she carried a small wooden bowl and asked for milk. No one knows what became of her, but for a moment, she existed on parchment, a soul caught between starvation and faith. Such names are the stars of this dark history, small, flickering points that prove the human constellation never entirely vanished. In some places, people turned to old wisdom. They foraged for edible herbs, mushrooms, even lichens that grew on stones. Women learned to boil bark to make flour. Men dug old storage pits that their grandfathers had abandoned. Communities shared tools, seeds, and silence. But famine also brought fear. When hunger lasts long enough, suspicion follows. Villages whispered of hoarders, of witches who had cursed the crops, of travelers bringing blight. It was easier to blame a stranger than to accept the randomness of suffering. The human mind, starved of food, still craves meaning. Still, amid the gloom, there were acts of quiet generosity that no chronicle could erase. A miller grinding the last of his grain for others before his own. A monk giving his cloak to a child. A shepherd walking for days to bring milk to the monastery kitchens. And there were the dreamers, those who believed the light would return. They looked toward the horizon each dusk, saying that one day the sun would shine clear again, as gold as the saints' halos in church mosaics. They had no proof, only instinct. As famine stretched on, stories turned into a kind of medicine. People told tales by the fire about how the world had once been full of warmth and song. Old grandmothers whispered that the sun had merely gone to sleep, and that when humanity proved its patience, it would wake again. And perhaps, in some deeper sense, they were right. The earth was healing, though no one could yet see it. Far away, volcanoes had stilled. The ash began to drift down and fade. But for now, the gray years lingered, and along the famine road, where the wind carried the smell of smoke and prayer, people kept walking, one foot, then the other, a rhythm older than despair. So, rest, dreamer. Remember, even when the world seems stripped bare, footsteps still move forward. The will to live is the last fire to go out. By the time the 6th year arrived, people had stopped counting years altogether. Time had lost its clear shape. It no longer came in circles of planting and harvest, but in waves of endurance, the long hunger, the long gray, the long silence. It was during this slow fade that a new fear began to move along the famine roads. Sickness, not the kind that came from cold or hunger, but something darker, nameless, born from decay and desperation. The chronicles speak of it only briefly, as though even the monks were reluctant to give it too much space on the page. They called it the Grey Cough, or the Pilgrim's Fever. It began with a chill that settled in the bones, and ended with a stillness that no warmth could undo. In towns where famine had already thinned the living, the fever finished what hunger had begun. The carts that once carried grain now carried the dead, and following one such cart, barefoot and silent, walked a pilgrim. No one knew his name. Some called him Brother Pale, for his face was as white as chalk. Others said he was not entirely alive, that he had been walking since the year the sun disappeared. Wherever he went, he prayed aloud in a language no one recognized. His prayer, it was said, could soothe even the dying. Mothers whispered it to their fevered children, though none of them knew what the words meant. It sounded like a lullaby. From before time, low, rhythmic, and strangely peaceful, the pilgrim carried no cross, no relic, only a small wooden bell, which he rang when he entered a new village. The sound was soft, hollow, not a warning, but a signal of presence. He did not ask for food. He did not accept shelter. He simply walked, following the plague carts from town to town. Some said he was an angel of death. Others believed he was sent by God to measure the souls who still held kindness in their hearts. In one winter-esque record, a monk named Father Odo wrote, "He came to us when the fever had taken 10 men. He stood by the gate and said nothing. We fed him broth. He blessed the broth and left. The next morning, the fever lessened." No other explanation was offered. The story of the pilgrim spread faster than the illness itself. People began to wait for him, hoping his silent prayers might protect their homes. When he came, they laid offerings, crests of bread, wooden crosses, dried flowers along the road. And when he left, they gathered the ashes of his campfires, believing them to be holy. In truth, no one ever saw where he slept. Some said he walked even at night, his figure barely visible in the dim light of the ash-choked sky. Others swore they saw him sitting beside rivers, staring into the water as if searching for something lost. The pilgrim became a mirror of the world, quiet, wandering, and enduring. He did not heal the land, but he gave people a way to bear it. Around this time, the rhythm of daily life changed again. Bells no longer rang at set hours. They rang for need, to announce the sick to summon, help to call the dead to rest. The monk said the sound of bells was what kept the darkness from swallowing them whole. And so, between famine and fever, between despair and prayer, the people found a strange steadiness. They began to help each other not because they believed the light would return, but because kindness was all that was left to give. In small ways, life continued. A baker used crushed acorns to make better bread. A mother wove cloth from nettle fibers. Children played games with stones and bits of bone, laughing in short bursts, as though the sound itself might keep the world alive. In that laughter brittle, fleeting, there was still humanity, and the pilgrim kept walking, following the road as it wound north and east, where snow fell thicker, and silence lay deeper. No one knew his destination. Perhaps not even he did, but wherever he passed, something shifted in the air. A calmness, a softening, a reminder that even in ruin, grace could wander unseen. When the fever finally faded, and the air began to warm again, people would still speak of him. They said he never aged, that one night he simply walked into the mist and disappeared, leaving behind his bell, hanging from a branch beside the road. The wind moved through it, making it sing. When the fever loosened its hold, the land seemed to take a long, shuddering breath, not of recovery, but of exhaustion. Crops had failed for 3 years. The sun still hid behind its strange, pale veil, and yet the people remained, thin, quiet, and marked by loss, but still moving, still tending fires. It was then that the rivers froze, not the shallow frost of a usual winter, but a deep, glassy stillness that reached to the riverbed. The water that once sang through every valley fell mute. Fish froze in place, caught mid. The villagers said even the spirits beneath the water had stopped whispering. The silence was uncanny. Bells, once rung to mark time or warn of plague, now echoed endlessly across the frozen land. Each chime seemed to hang in the air too long, as if time itself were reluctant to move forward. For months, the great rivers became roads. Merchants dragged their carts across them, hooves striking the ice like dull drums. Some thought it a miracle, a path where there had been only danger before. Others saw it as a final sign that the world was turning to stone. Indanur monks recorded how the Thames froze so hard that entire fairs were held upon it. Candles, carts, games, even a wooden church, all built on ice. For a brief season, people danced and laughed above the trapped current, pretending the cold was only a backdrop to joy. But below, the frozen river held secrets. Beneath its clear surface, branches, stones, and bodies lay sealed offerings from the months of hunger and fever. Children pressed their hands to the ice, peering into what looked like another world, one without sound, without motion. Some swore they saw faces looking back. That winter, a priest in France wrote, "The ice is thick, yet fragile. We walk upon what could swallow us in an instant." Is this not faith itself? For those who still lived, faith had indeed changed shape. It was no longer found only in churches or prayers, but in endurance, in waking up one more morning and lighting one more fire and listening for the faint creak of the ice beneath one's feet and choosing to walk on anyway. In villages along the frozen rivers, new kinds of quiet work began. Men carved tools from bone. Women unraveled old cloth to make thread. Monks etched words on wood, since parchment had become too rare to waste. The script was shaky, uneven, yet still they wrote. It was as if, in the stillness of the ice, they were determined to keep movement alive through thought. One abbey near Cologne kept a record called The Winter of Endless Sound. Its author described how every bell rang differently that season, sharper, colder, almost metallic. He wrote, "Even the air has weight. When the bell tolls, the sound does not travel far. It folds back upon itself, as if the world has forgotten how to echo." But not all was sorrow. There were stories, too, of strange beauty, of wolves walking calmly through villages, their fur white with frost, of light seen over the horizon, pale green curtains that shimmered where no star should have been. People whispered that the heavens were trying to comfort them, painting the darkness with movement. Sometimes, when the night was still and the frost hung heavy on the trees, the bells would stop. No one rang them, not a soul in sight, yet a single chime would sound, deep and low, rolling through the frozen air like a heartbeat. No one ever discovered who, or what, made the sound. Perhaps it was the wind, perhaps it was the earth remembering itself. But each time it rang, villagers paused their work, closed their eyes, and listened, for that heartbeat reminded them of something larger. Not warmth exactly, but a pulse of life that had not yet vanished. Slowly, as spring neared, cracks began to appear in the ice. First thin white lines, then sudden, echoing snaps. The rivers, which had lain silent for months, began to stir again, not rushing, but sighing. The thaw came reluctantly, but it came, and with it, a new kind of hope. Not the bright, careless hope of sunlight and harvest, but the quiet endurance of those who have seen the worst and still believe in the faint possibility of better days. They rang the bells again that spring. The sound, softer now, carried across the valleys like a promise. Spring came, though no one could quite call it that. The air softened, yes, but the light remained weak, the sun still a ghost behind the clouds. The snow melted into grey mud, and the rivers, newly freed, carried away everything the winter had entombed. Branches, debris, lost tools, and sometimes a memory no one wished to see again. The bells rang often during those first weeks, not in joy, but in habit, as if people were afraid that silence might bring the frost back. The sound of bells meant the world was still moving, still breathing. But in time, they began to fade again. In one small hamlet, a young bell ringer named Elric noticed the stillness first. His tower overlooked the fields, and each morning he would pull the rope and listen as the tones spread across the valley. But one day, it didn't. The sound rose, echoed once, and stopped, as though the air itself had swallowed it. He tried again. The same thing. Word spread quickly. People gathered below the tower, listening to the half-formed chime. It was as if something invisible hung between the sound and the sky, blocking it from leaving. The villagers began to whisper that the heavens were still not ready to listen, that maybe, after so many prayers, silence was now God's answer. But others thought differently. An old woman named Elaine, who had lived through both the hunger and the fever, said quietly, "The world is resting. Let it rest. Even the bells must sleep." And so, for a time, they did. Without the bells, time became soft again, shapeless. People worked by instinct, tending the few green shoots that dared rise from the muddy soil, patching roofs, gathering herbs that managed to grow through the grey mist. There was a kind of peace in it, not happiness, but stillness, like the moment before dawn, when the world holds its breath. In the monasteries, the monks continued to write. Their ink grew thin, their candles smaller, but they persisted. Their words described not grand miracles, but small mercies. A loaf shared among three, a birth after loss, a patch of blue sky glimpsed for the first time in months. It was in one of these monasteries, far in the north, that a young scribe began to copy an older text, a treatise on the stars, written before the dark years began. As he worked, he paused over a line that read, "The heavens turn, even when unseen." He stared at it for a long time, the candlelight trembling across the page. It was a simple thought, but it stirred something deep within him, a reminder that movement did not need to be visible to be real. That evening, he went outside and looked up. The clouds shifted briefly, and for the first time in years, he saw the faintest shimmer of a star. It was small, pale, but steady. He didn't tell anyone. Some things were too precious to be spoken aloud, but he wrote it in the margin of his book, "The first star returns." Elsewhere, in the villages, people began to find their own quiet signs of renewal. A child was born healthy, a seed sprouted early, the frozen wells ran clear, and sometimes, on certain nights, when the wind changed direction, the faintest sound of a bell could be heard again. Not loud, not the proud tolla before, but a gentle note that drifted between valleys, as if coming from far, far away. No one knew who rang it. Some said it was Elric, the bell ringer, testing his ropes once more. Others believed it was the pilgrim, the pale traveler who had vanished into the mist, now walking unseen, still carrying his wooden bell, reminding the world to keep breathing. Whatever the truth, people listened. They stood in their doorways, eyes lifted toward the dim sky, and for a brief moment, they felt something that hadn't been felt in years. Connection. Not to kings, or priests, or even to the sun, but to each other. And in that fragile connection, something stirred, the faintest hum beneath the soil, the whisper of roots wakened, of rivers remembering their flow. The world was not healed, not yet, but it had begun to listen again. It began almost quietly, a shadow crossing the sky, then another, and another. At first, people thought it was smoke or drifting ash, but then came the sound, soft, rhythmic, layered, the beating of wings. After so many years of silence, the birds had returned. They came from the south, in cautious flocks, tracing paths they had not flown in a generation. Crows and starlings, ravens and sparrows, and even the small nightingales whose songs had once filled the summer woods. No one had realized how empty the world had become until that moment, when the first call echoed across the village roofs. Thin, trembling, but alive, people stopped what they were doing. They looked, up, some shading their eyes, others weeping softly without knowing why. The birds did not come all at once. They arrived like memories, in fragments, in moments. One day, a single bird perched on a frozen fence. The next, a group flew over the river, testing the air. By the end of the month, the sky itself seemed to remember its old language. The monks, who had filled their margins with silence, now began writing again. In one chronicle from York, a brother named Stephanus wrote, "The sky, though pale, is no longer empty. It feels like the breath of the world has returned." The birds brought more than sound. They brought seeds. In their feathers, their feet, their bellies, grains from distant lands fell once again upon northern soil. Wildflowers appeared where none had grown for years. Grass crept up the walls of ruined cottages. Bees, slow and confused, followed. Life, in its smallest and most fragile form, had begun to rebuild the world, and with it, something within the people changed. The villagers no longer stared endlessly at the horizon waiting for sunlight. They looked instead to the earth, the ground beneath their feet, the stubborn sprouts forcing their way through the gray. It was Elric, the bell ringer, who first noticed the difference in sound. The air, which for years had felt heavy and unmoving, now carried echoes again. When he rang the bell that morning, it sang not loudly, but cleanly, carrying farther than it had in years. The villagers stopped in the fields to listen. The sound rolled over them like warmth. Some began to hum with it. There was still hardship. Crops failed more often than not, and hunger was never far away. But the birds had brought something that even food could not give rhythm. The sky now changed. With the days, clouds moved faster, wind shifted, and the seasons began to find their pattern again. Old songs returned, to the ones grandmothers had sung before the dark years. They were simple songs, of rain, of harvest, of journeys, but when sung aloud, they reminded people of the time when the world had been predictable, and that memory alone gave them peace. In the monasteries, art began to reappear. Illuminated letters grew brighter. Blues and golds returned to the pages. Monks who once copied words in silence now hummed as they worked. One wrote, "In the birds, I hear forgiveness." The nobility, what was left of them, began to rebuild as well. Castles were patched with new stone, fields fenced again. But it was not the lords who brought renewal. It was the quiet persistence of the peasants. The same hands that had buried the dead now planted the living. In one region, farmers left crumbs of bread on the rooftops each morning, a small offering to the birds that had carried life back to them. The old woman, a lion, who had once said even bells must sleep, was seen scattering seeds into the wind, whispering blessings as she did so. "Go on," she said. "Remind the earth how to be soft." The children grew up not fearing the sky anymore. They pointed at flocks and asked where they came from. The elders told them stories that the birds had flown to the edge of the world when the sun vanished, waiting until it was safe to return. Some believed that, when the birds left, they had carried away all the color of the world, and now, in their feathers, they brought it back. And indeed, that spring, the world began to show color again. Faint, hesitant, but real. The first blue of the forget-me-nots, the gold shimmer of new wheat, the green, deep and steady, of moss along the stone walls. The sound of wings became the sound of healing. Even the bells seemed to follow their rhythm, ringing softer now, not out of fear, but in harmony with the world's slow return to life. And when the first nightingale sang again, deep in the forest, beneath a fragile moon, those who heard it said it felt like the world itself was dreaming. It began, almost without notice, a faint brightness at the edge of dawn that lingered a moment longer each morning. People did not trust it at first. For years, the sky had tricked them with false dawns and colorless days. But this was different. The light was warmer. It moved. It stayed. Elric saw it first from the bell tower. He had climbed before sunrise, as he always did, to ring the morning call. But when he looked east, the horizon was brushed with a hue he hadn't seen since childhood. Not gray, not pale gold, but amber. It was the color of honey and dust, soft and alive. He waited, breath held, half afraid to blink, and then it happened. The sun rose, not hidden, not veiled whole. The bells rang themselves that morning, or so it seemed. Elric pulled the rope, and the sound leapt outward, soaring over the hills. It carried farther than ever before. Villagers came running into the streets, shielding their eyes, faces bathed in light. Some laughed, others wept. A few simply knelt in the mud and whispered thanks. It had been 6 years since they had last seen the full sun. From every corner of the valley, a murmur spread. The sun had returned. The warmth was back. The world was forgiven. 4 weeks after, The light felt strange, as though the earth did not quite remember what to do with it. Rivers glittered in ways unfamiliar. Stones glowed. Birds seemed dazed, circling as if relearning their sky. Even shadows looked odd, sharp, unfamiliar after years of blur. In the monasteries, the scribes laid down their quills and stepped outside, blinking at the brightness. One wrote, "We did not realize how dim we had become until the light reminded us what color was." Life rushed back with startling speed. The snowmelt turned the fields soft and ready. Seeds that had waited dormant for years began to sprout. Children ran barefoot through puddles. Bees returned to the hives that had hung silent. People no longer prayed for survival. They began to pray for gratitude. In the great abbey at Canterbury, a monk lit a candle at midday simply to watch how it burned beside the sunlight. He wrote, in wonder, "Two lights now dance in one world." Across the continent, the news spread from village to village, not through letters or heralds, but through the voices of travelers and the songs of pilgrims. The words were simple. The sky is blue again. And so began what many later called the Year of Return. But not everything that came back was the same. The people had changed. Those who had lived through the dark years no longer took the light for granted. They walked slower, spoke softer, worked with gentler hands. They knew how easily the world could fall quiet. The lords, too, found themselves humbled. Some had survived the famines and fevers only because their peasants had shared food or tended their wounded. For the first time, they saw how fragile their power truly was, how dependent they were on the hands of those they once barely noticed. In some regions, new traditions began. Every spring morning, when the first sunlight touched the village roofs, the bells were rung not for worship, but for memory, a reminder of the years when there had been no sound at all. And though the pilgrim was never seen again, many claimed to hear his bell in the distance on certain days, faint, almost like the hum of the wind. To some it was a blessing. To others, a reminder of humility. The children who grew up in that reborn light never knew the darkness their parents spoke of. To them, the world had always been warm, and the rivers had always run. But the old ones remembered. They remembered the frozen bells, the gray skies, the sound of silence, and sometimes, as the sun set, they would tell the children stories, not to frighten them, but to teach them the rhythm of endurance. They told them about the birds that returned, about the light that waited behind the clouds, and about the quiet courage of those who kept living when the world seemed to have ended. In one of those stories, they spoke of a bell that never stopped ringing, even when no one could hear it. A sound that kept time when time itself faltered. That was how they described the years of darkness. Not as an ending, but as a long night through which the world had to sleep before waking anew. And when dawn came, the first rays of sunlight spilled over fields, still scarred by famine, still fragile, but alive. The people looked to the light, and for the first time in years, they did not fear tomorrow. They had learned what it meant to be human, not through triumph, but through quiet endurance. And the bells rang on. The sunlight had returned, but with it came a new kind of wonder, and a new kind of belief. The old world of faith, carved in stone and spoken in Latin, began to mingle with something softer, older, and closer to the ground. For the first time in generations, people began to speak openly about what they felt, not only what they were told to believe. The priests preached that God had forgiven humanity, that the dim years were punishment now lifted. But the peasants, the farmers, and the women who gathered herbs at the forest's edge whispered a different story. They said the sun had not been angry. It had been asleep, and when it awoke, it found them still there, still tending their small fires, still sharing bread, still singing. That, they said, was why it had chosen to return. This gentle, earth-bound belief spread quietly, not as rebellion, but as comfort. The people did not abandon their churches, but they began to build new rituals beside them. Small things, like leaving bowls of milk for the barn cats that had kept the rats away, or scattering crumbs for the birds that had carried back life. They planted trees, not just for wood, but for memory, for the years of hunger, they'd say, pressing their hands into the soil. And in the evenings, when the sky turned red and the bells rang, they would tell stories. Children gathered around fires to hear tales of how the rivers had frozen and how brave hearts had kept the world alive. They spoke of the pilgrim with the belna, part man, part legend. Some said he had been a saint sent from God. Others swore he was the spirit of the land itself, walking until the world was ready to wake. There were new songs, 2 lullabies for a tired world. One went, "When the sun forgot the sky, we lit candles." You and I, when the wind refused to sing, Still, we waited for the spring. The monks recorded them carefully, sensing that something sacred lived in these simple verses. Faith was no longer confined to cathedrals. It had wandered into the fields, the hearths, and the hearts of those who had learned in time. This shift began to reach the nobility as well. Kings who had once ruled through fear now found their words less powerful than a peasant's story. One chronicler wrote of a lord who ordered the tale of the sleeping sun to be painted on his hallless walls, saying, "Let my children know what silence means." The world's rhythm had changed. Festivals returned, but they were quieter now, slower. The people celebrated not war or kingship, but survival. The harvest fair became a thanksgiving to the earth itself. The spring rite, once full of pomp, now began with silence, a moment to remember those who had not lived to see the light return. In villages across Europe, a strange pattern began to appear. A bell hung from a tree, not in a church, not in a tower, but among branches. The first time it rang, it startled the birds, but soon they grew used to it. The people said it reminded the forest to keep watch. And so, bell and bird sang together, one of iron, one of wing. The blend of religion and nature gave birth to a gentler way of seeing the world. The monks, once stern chroniclers of sin and punishment, began to write of kindness, as though they, too, had learned that the smallest mercy was the truest form of devotion. One scribe, Brother Alaric, wrote in the margin of his manuscript, "Faith is not what survives the fire, it is what tends the embers after." As the years went on, tales of the dark sun grew less like history and more like myth. But they carried wisdom, the kind that could not be lost to time. Every mother, every father, every traveler who told the story added a piece of themselves to it. They taught their children that the world is fragile but patient, that silence is not the end, and that the smallest act of kindness can keep the darkness from swallowing everything. And when, at last, a generation was born that had never known the long night, the story became their bedtime song, soft, rhythmic, steady, told to them as they drifted into dreams. It began always the same way. Once, there was a time when the sun forgot to rise. Even after decades of warmth, the memory of those cold, dim years never quite faded. It lingered like a faint shadow beneath the brightness of every morning, a quiet reminder that the world could change without warning. Old people still looked to the horizon differently than the young. When the sun slipped behind a cloud for too long, their eyes would tighten, their hands stilling over their work. "It's nothing," they would murmur. But deep inside, they remembered. The elders told their grandchildren about frost creeping through cracks, about days when noon looked like dusk, and about the year when even firewood felt useless. They didn't tell these stories to frighten, but to teach, to make the young value what they had. Some nights, whole families would sit together under the stars, pointing upward. "That one," they'd say, "is the star that watched over us when the world was dark." It was not science, not astronomy, but devotion in another form. In monasteries and manor houses alike, people began keeping small lamps burning through the night, even when they slept. They called them guard flames. Some said they kept away evil. Others said they kept away forgetfulness, because to forget the darkness, te belibet, was to invite it back. But even memory softened over time. A century later, the year of the dim sun became a fable more than a fact. The manuscripts that recorded volcanic skies and frozen fields were read by scholars who frowned and argued over details. It was dust, said some. It was God's will, said others. And somewhere, between faith and science, truth quietly waited. In the north, farmers still sang to their fields before planting, whispering thanks to the sun as they pressed seeds into the soil. In southern towns, artists painted strange, red-tinted sunsets, not from imagination, but because memories still lived in their blood. Those paintings glowed with warmth and melancholy. In one, a small figure, perhaps a monk, perhaps a child, stood alone under a sky streaked with copper light. Above him, faint rays broke through clouds, as if hope itself were descending. Beneath it, in careful script, the painter had written, "For the year when the sun forgot." Even in distant lands, where no one remembered the event itself, echoes remained. A lullaby in Russia spoke of the sick son, who slept too long. In Ireland, a tale told of the day the sky wept ash. Across continents, pieces of the same sorrow had survived, changed, translated, but still recognizable. The memory became like a shared dream among humankind. And dreams, even when faded, have their own kind of endurance. It's strange how tragedy can shape beauty. Out of the dim years came a tenderness, a patience in art, in song, in how people treated one another. The silence had taught them something no sermon could. That light is never to be taken for granted. When scholars centuries later discovered tree rings that confirmed the Great Cooling, they were astonished. It truly happened, they said. The year without summer. But for the people who still sang the old songs, no confirmation was needed. They had always known, because truth, in its deepest form, doesn't always live in records or research. Sometimes it hides in stories whispered, sung, carried by generations until it becomes part of the air itself. Even now, when you close your eyes and imagine that dim sky, the way the light faded, the way people looked up, afraid but unbroken, you are touching that same memory, and somewhere, beneath the layers of time and earth, it still waits. A world once plunged into shadow, and a humanity that learned to endure. Centuries passed differently for the earth than for people. Where humans count years in harvests and rains, the earth counts in layers ash upon soil, pollen beneath clay, each thin stratum a quiet line in the book of time. Deep below the roots of old forests, that year still lingers. Geologists today can find it in the record. A thin gray layer spread across continents, rich in sulfur and glassy particles, the fingerprint of a faraway volcano, or perhaps more than one. The Earth never forgets. When scientists first uncovered that layer, they were astonished by its reach, from the ice cores of Greenland to the peat bogs of Ireland, to the dark soils of Japan. The same story lay hidden beneath every nation, every climate. It was proof that once the sky dimmed for all, and so the past began to speak again. In modern labs under the hum of gentle lights, researchers watched tiny samples of ancient ice melt, releasing trapped air from the 6th century. Inside those bubbles, they found the story humanity had half forgotten: sulfur, dust, and the faint memory of fire. They could almost hear the silence of that long-ago summer, somewhere between the poetry of monks and the precision of machines. The two worlds met, the mystic and the measurable, each validating the other in their own quiet way. But even more moving than the science is the endurance. The way life simply continued. The way, after the dimming, seeds still sprouted, hands still baked bread, bells still rang. In one monastery's chronicle, written years after the famine ended, a monk wrote, "The sun, once hidden, returned not all at once, but softly, like a candle rekindled by unseen hands." That line survived when so much else was lost, and you can almost feel the gratitude in it. For the people who lived then, the world had changed. They did not know why, but they knew how to endure. The fields that once starved slowly grew green again. Rivers to wade, birds returned. A generation raised on fear now raised children in gentler days. Yet, even in abundance, they moved carefully, never wasting, never assuming the sun would always rise the same way. It's humbling to imagine them, a mother teaching her son to pray for light, a craftsman etching a cross above his workshop door for warmth and mercy, a farmer murmuring to the sky before dawn, not words of fear, but thanks. Because after living through a year when the world nearly froze, gratitude itself became sacred. Even today, traces of that humility remain in rituals, in prayers, in the small ways people turn toward the light at sunrise. The instinct to honor what once was lost. When the earth remembered, it didn't do so with bitterness. It did what it always does, healed layer by layer. And perhaps that is the quietest miracle of all, that even the most terrible seasons can vanish into the soil, leaving behind not scars, but lessons. And as night deepens, you might feel that lesson yourself, that calm, steady truth, that no darkness lasts forever. It didn't happen all at once. The light came back shyly, as though testing the world before trusting it again. At first, mornings were only faintly brighter, the mist hanging lower, but the color in the sky warmer, a promise of something the people had nearly forgotten. One chronicler wrote, "We woke, and the fields no longer shivered." Another described how the first true dawn after the long dimness struck the church bell golden again. Imagine that moment, after months of gray, a sliver of sunlight trembling on the wall, and someone simply standing there, wordless, letting it touch their face. For peasants and kings alike, it must have felt like a resurrection. That spring, wheat rose taller than it had in years. The rivers loosened, carrying away the silt and sorrow that had clung to them. Birds returned from nowhere, filling the air with impossible songs. People began to rebuild what had been abandoned. Roofs were mended, fields cleared, roads opened once more. But the world that emerged was not quite the same. The dark year had taught them fragility and patience. In village after village, People planted more than they needed, stored what they could, and shared more freely. They remembered the nights of hunger, when a stranger's kindness could mean survival. And so, generosity became a kind of faith. Across Europe and Asia, stories spread of divine forgiveness of God, restoring the warmth after testing humankind. In distant lands, where no one knew of the volcanoes or the science behind them, people still sensed that something vast had passed, a reckoning, followed by mercy. And as the years softened, the fear became memory, then myth, then meaning. Children born in the years of light grew up hearing tales of a time when the sun went away. Some thought it a fable, some thought it a punishment, but for the old, who had seen the gray skies themselves, the return of light was not just weather, it was proof of endurance. In the manuscripts of that age, you find small notes, scribbled between prayers and taxes, human traces that shimmer like candlelight. The wheat came green again. The children laugh now. The Lord has turned his face once more toward us. Simple words, but in them, you can feel what it must have meant, that after despair, warmth had come back. And so, the world went on. Empires rose, languages shifted, faiths changed. Yet somewhere under all of it, in every dawn that spills across the earth, the same old rhythm beats the memory of that lost summer and the lesson it left behind. That even when the sky darkens, the light remembers the way home. So as you lie here tonight, listening to your own quiet breath, imagine that dawn, the slow return of gold to the horizon, the sound of distant bells, the warmth brushing against your closed eyelids. The sun is patient. It always finds its way back. Thank you, dreamer, for walking through the shadows of history tonight, for wandering the years when the world dimmed, and finding the calm where light returned. And when morning comes, may it find you just as they found theirs, gently and full of quiet wonder.